This episode, I'm joined by David Edmonds to discuss the life and philosophy of Derek Parfit. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep it running, please find links in the descriptions below. Otherwise, please enjoy. David Edmonds, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
We are going to be discussing your recently published book, Parfit, A Philosopher and His Mission to Save Morality, which was published by Princeton. And a big thank you for them for sending me a copy of the book, which is an absolutely beautiful hardback edition. This is a book about a fairly unknown philosopher who passed away in 2017, I believe, Derek Parfit, who is considered by people within the philosophy of ethics as probably will go down canonized as one of the greats of the philosophy of ethics. But, you know, he is an unknown thinker. He lived a life that I was thinking about this morning. His life was like the equivalent of a modern day Kant. He stayed in one area, and you would think, what makes this worthwhile for a biography? But he was very eccentric, and we have a lot of peculiarities to talk about. So thanks for joining us. But just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why it is you came to write this biography of Parfit.
Well, what do? I'm really a full-time writer myself now. I've got some podcasts, such as Philosophy Bites and Social Science Bites, and one called Philosophy 24/7. I am an ex-BBC journalist. I gave up the day job a couple of years ago, although I was only part-time. I have an academic link with the Uhira Centre for Practical Ethics, where I'm a distinguished research fellow, where I've been for about 15 years now. So I do a sort of combination of philosophy and writing and journalism, I guess. I came to write the book because, well, I've never written a biography before, but I was well placed to write this particular book because Derek was my BPhil supervisor. So I did a degree called the BPhil at Oxford in the mid-80s, a long, long time ago now. And then later on, I did a PhD, and my supervisor was Janet Radcliffe Richards, who became Derek's wife. So I had a link both with Derek and with Janet. So yeah, I was in a good position to write the book. As you say, he died in 2017. His legacy, philosophical legacy, is contested. So there are indeed many philosophers, moral philosophers, who believe he's one of the most important moral philosophers of the 20th century. There were some who definitely disagree with that. So it's not uncontested claim about his significance. But yeah, certainly there are lots of people who think that he's going to be read in decades to come. And despite the fact that he was mainly based in one place, namely Oxford, his life was more interesting than one might imagine.
And did you happen to have much correspondence with him in his later years, or was it mostly around that BPhil?
Yeah, so he was my co-supervisor when I did my BPhil, and you have to do a dissertation, so you do 3 papers in those days and a kind of mini thesis. And my dissertation was on obligations to future people and the philosophy of future generations and how we should reflect about future people who will exist but are not yet born, was really a subgenre of moral philosophy invented by Derek Parfit. And now it's a flourishing area in moral philosophy. Lots of people write about the puzzles and the conundrums that he established, that he set up. So obviously I had some dealings with him then. And then later on, when I was working with Janet, I had a few more dealings with him. I guess I had the most dealings with him in 2014, when I wrote a very long article on both Janet and Derek for Prospect magazine. So Prospect magazine had run a poll on the most important intellectuals in the world. And I think they named 50 people, and 2 of them were Janet and Derek. So I wrote to Prospect and said, did you realize that they knew each other. In fact, of course, they were married. And they said, no, they didn't realize that. So I said, well, I can write an article about the two of them. And, you know, they've got an unconventional marriage, let's put it that way. So I wrote a very long article about both Janet and Derek and went to see them and then had some correspondence with Derek about the article, which I relay in the book. It's kind of a long story, but there's a very funny story associated with it and some kind of screw up where I send Derek the wrong article. And he thinks that I'm going to publish this bunch of notes because I sent him the wrong Word article rather than the actual polished article. And he says, I can't publish it. And he doesn't realize, and I didn't realize I sent him completely the wrong article. But he misinterpreted this document that couldn't possibly be an article for the article itself. So I had some dealings with him then. And then later on, I was at the UHero Centre. In theory, he was at the UHero Centre as well. And in theory, we shared an office. But in practice, did I see him at all? I'm not sure. He very, very rarely came into the UHero Centre. He preferred to work from home. So I had some interactions with him, but I knew Janet much better than I knew Derek. I think that's fair to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that story that you tell there is pretty funny in the book. I mean, I think you say something like he's the only person sort of in existence who would ever think that the notes you sent him could have been published. But I think it says a lot about his character that, you know, that the just to jump into his character, which is almost we can't split the two because the way he approached philosophy is completely entwined with his eccentricities. But this notion of being completely and utterly sincere and authentic about whatever it is you put before him and taking it 100% seriously. In this case, of course, your notes, like literally just notes for an article, which you say no one else would have ever thought.
I mean, that might be hyperbole. There may be one or two other people. No, you're right. I do say that, but I think it obviously might be hyperbole on Mike. There were probably one or two other people in the world who might have taken it completely literally, but it was absurd to think that the document I sent was an article because it was full of half sentences. And it was just my notes that I transcribed when I'd been in his and Janet's house at the time they were in North London. And I was just kind of taking some quotes. And obviously, when you're taking notes, some of my sentences weren't complete. And it didn't have a beginning, it didn't have a middle, it didn't have an end, it had no argument, it had no descriptions of them. It obviously was not an article, but because I'd sent it to Derek and because I said, here's the article, he believed it was the article. And he took things very literally in that regard. And there are other stories about him taking things very literally as well. And it was a very kind of odd story, but I thought it did illustrate something about Derek's character.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess to really jump into the deep end and to tie the two cornerstones that your book is dealing with together, which is Derek's eccentricity, Parfit's eccentricity, and his sort of almost absolutist approach to the question of morality within. So maybe if we can sum up the problem that Parfit is really dealing with in terms of philosophy, it is simply the objectivity of morality, of how can morality be objective, and also I guess once like God immediately in Parfit's life becomes sort of a non-thing, right? That's done. Let's move forward with the objectivity of morality and tying in his biography, which is his just sort of absolute all or nothing approach. If this is the thing I'm doing, then this is the question I'm trying to answer, and that really was his life. I guess there's two questions there. What do you think there's any biographical reasons he was so absolute about his focus? And then secondly, I mean, do you think I'm right on stating that his primary question was the objectivity of morality?
It was certainly, to answer the second question first, it was certainly his primary question in the last 20 years of his life. So in the first period of his life, he's working on a bunch of other problems, and they emerge in one of only two philosophy books he publishes in his life, Reasons and Persons, which is published in 1984. And that book is probably the book he will be remembered for, and that covers a bunch of just extraordinarily interesting questions. I've mentioned already obligations to future people and puzzles about how we should think about future people. But another big area he covers in that, and as I say, there are lots of areas, but another huge area that he's very famous for is the question of personal identity and what it is that makes one person the same person over time. And he makes kind of pioneering contributions to that debate. And then that book is published, and it takes him a few years, but eventually he becomes very disturbed by the question of whether morality is objective. And it's a question he's put aside until then, because until that moment he's regarded what is called metaethics, the kind of status of moral claims, he's regarded as that as too complicated, and he wanted to get into substantial arguments about what our obligations are to future people, rather than these meta claims about, are these propositions we make about moral statements, are they true, are they false, are they kind of relative to one society or not? He thought that was just too difficult for him. And then he began to get disturbed by the realization that many other very important philosophers thought that morality was subjective. And he wanted to show that morality was objective, and he thought that if morality wasn't based on this firm ground, then subsequent claims about how we should act with regard to whatever it was, future people, or whether claims about abortion or capital punishment or climate change or euthanasia or bioethics or whatever the substantial moral issue was, that they would somehow, they wouldn't be on firm ground, and we would, in a way, they would be sort of meaningless. And so the last 20 years of his life, probably at least, was based on an investigation of whether morality was objective or not, and his very strong claim and his strong belief, which he tried to show with argumentation, that morality was objective. He had indeed given up religion. He was initially, he was born into a sort of religious family, in that both his parents and all his grandparents were missionaries, but his parents became disillusioned by religion, and he himself, having gone through a very early religious stage, abandoned religion aged about 7. He was convinced by, well, he wouldn't have called it this at the time, but the problem of evil. It's known as the problem of evil in theology, the idea that how could an all-good, all-powerful God allow suffering to exist in the world? And he thought there was no good argument to that, and he abandoned religion very early on. So his project was really to reconstruct ethics on secular grounds. And so there was definitely that strong biographical link between his project and his life.
Mm-hmm. And this notion of suffering seems to be almost at times almost lightly romantic underpinning of his life and his work. I mean, you tell these anecdotes of people going to see lectures by Parfit where he's almost in tears talking about the suffering in the world and talking about this as like a very personal problem that he had to take onto his shoulders. But there's a few anecdotes of, this sort of very personable approach to this suffering, as if it's a reality there for him. And basically the question is, why do you think it mattered this much to him? Because it is it's extreme,
So he did take an extreme approach to philosophy, which I describe in the book, and that involved abandoning almost everything else to focus on these philosophical questions, and which did mean that there was some collateral damage, to put it mildly, in terms of some of his personal relationships, because he thought that addressing the philosophical problems was the most important thing he could do. It was because he thought, as I say, that if morality wasn't objective, then life was meaningless, that we had to believe and we had to show that philosophy was objective for the rest of our lives to have some kind of meaning. Now, most people don't believe that, but he did feel it very deeply indeed. And the suffering he felt about the suffering of others, when he felt very personally, he could feel very personally the suffering of others. I think that's linked to his consequentialist instincts. And I mean, that's what I suggest in the book. So he was broadly a consequentialist in that he thought that what mattered was the consequences of our actions. He tries to show towards the end of his life that these different approaches to ethics, one of which is consequentialism, another which is Kantianism. There's a third approach to moral philosophy, which is known as contractualism. He tried to show that these weren't as different as people had imagined. But he's always seen as a kind of consequentialist figure, somebody who believes that when you act, you should think about primarily the consequences of your actions. And one of the implications of that is that one should take the consequences of of strangers, how strangers are affected by one's actions, as well as the consequences of one's nearest and dearest. And most people find it quite difficult to empathize with the suffering of strangers. He found it very easy. I mean, it's not like he tried very hard. It just, he felt the suffering of others, the suffering of strangers very directly in a very unusual way. So that if somebody started talking about the suffering of people, even those who had suffered, let's say, in a war a century ago, the World War One, in the trenches of World War One, he would well up thinking about how dreadful their lives had been. And he found it more difficult, I think, than most people, to empathize with the suffering of his nearest and dearest. So he was willing to sacrifice the feelings of his nearest and dearest to his wider philosophical project, namely trying to show that morality was objective. And he didn't feel that disjunction that most of us feel between the importance of our nearest and dearest and the importance of distant strangers. For him, that gap was unusually narrow, I would say.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, you mentioned that he's a consequentialist, because the other big part that you've already mentioned of his philosophy is this notion of the personal identity, and this notion of, are we the same person going forward through our lives? Both mine and yourself, are we quite literally, the baby and then the child and then the teenager that we were? Is this the same person going forward? And yet there is also the concept. So how does he match the two between consequences of actions and an identity which holds throughout all those consequences?
Yeah, so when he writes Reasons and Persons, it's full of very different ideas, but what holds them together is a kind of consequentialism. So he writes Reasons and Persons because he's under a great deal of pressure by his college in Oxford to do so, because he hasn't yet written a book, even though he's been at the college for a long time. And he throws together what could have been lots of different books, but they are bound together by this consequentialist philosophy. And so one way they're bound together is that if you believe, as Parfit believed, that there's no essence of us, that there's nothing which I can point to which makes you, James Ellis, the same person over time. There isn't an essence of you. The gap between you and other people becomes narrower, because there isn't something that makes you essentially different from other people. Equally, the gap between you and your past selves and your future selves, that grows, because again, there's nothing that makes you essentially the same person that you were when you were young and that you will be when you're old. And so that's the connection there between his personal identity and his consequentialism, because the consequentialist thinks that when you're thinking about how you should act, thinks that you should take the consequences of all individuals seriously, not just the consequences to yourself or to your family or to your friends, but the consequences of everybody. And his idea of personal identity brings other people closer. And so it makes it more natural, as it were, to take the implications for other people of your actions more seriously. And so that's the connection between those two big ideas.
What? So how can it be then that there can be others if there is no individual thing which we consider to be that, when we get to what religious language would call the soul or the authentic self or the ego or whatever it is that says, okay, that is that person's inner essence. How can it be that we can go, oh, that's a person? I mean, of course, is it a purely material? We are bodies?
We're not bodies. What he thinks masters is psychological continuity. So I'm looking at both of us, and both of us, I imagine, because we're on video when we're talking, I imagine that both of us had more hair 20 years ago, at least on the top of our heads. And but the fact that we have lost our hair, that doesn't mean that we're not the same person. What matters, according to Parfit, is that we have psychological continuity. What does that mean? That means we have memories, for example, so I can remember what I was like even when I did have hair. I imagine you can do the same. We have character dispositions, so my character hasn't fundamentally changed. I might have altered slightly in certain ways, but essentially, if somebody met me, they would think, "Oh, yeah, he hasn't got any hair," but I can see that's David Edmonds. He's as he was, he's as irritating as he used to be, or whatever. Or so we've got psychological continuity, we've got memories. It's that really matters as far as Parfit is concerned. As to what it is we're doing when we're helping other people, when we're thinking about other people, well, they themselves are beings with psychological continuity. So we're not helping people with any essences. We're helping people. People suffer. People go through life. We want to reduce the suffering and increase the well-being of others. But other people don't have essences, just as we don't have essences. But just like us, they are moving through time. There's psychological continuity, and we're helping these other beings that don't have an essence, just as we don't have an essence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How does this position on personal identity change over time for Parfit? Does it have much development?
Well, it does, and on the whole, that's an interesting question, because on the whole, Parfit doesn't change his views about very much. But when it comes to personal identity, it does change. So it's a complicated argument, but he imagines in one of his famous thought experiments that we go into a teletransporter and we're beamed up to our body is dispersed in all its kind of molecules. We disintegrate and we're reconstituted on Mars, and then we come back to Earth, then we go off to Mars again, we come back to Earth. We do this many times. He imagines one day we go up to Mars through the teletransporter, and the person in the white coat says, well, this time you can speak. A copy of you, your original you, is staying on Earth. You can speak to your copy in Mars, and you're speaking to your copy on Mars. The copy is exactly the same as you. You can even see the shaving cut of the cut that you made that morning when you were shaving. And then the person in the white coat says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. We just discovered that in doing this, that the original you're going to have a cardiac failure in 30 minutes or whatever, and only the copy on Mars is going to be left." And Parfit asks us to imagine how we should regard that. And initially, in Reasons and Persons, Parfit's view is, well, everything that has survived, that should matter to you, has survived. So the fact that your original is, as it were, disappearing should make no difference to you at all. Later on, although he continues to believe that psychological continuity is what matters, he comes to this idea that nonetheless our psychological continuity is housed within a body. So that what you are, James Ellis, you are this person housed within your body. So if your body dies, you die. But you're not identical to your body. What you are is your psychological makeup. So if your body dies, in a sense, you die, because you are inside your body. But that's not what you are. Essentially, what matters to you is psychological continuity. So in this imaginary case where you go up to Mars and your original dies, he might be prepared to say later on that you have gone, you've disappeared, you have died, but nonetheless what matters has survived. Mm-hmm. In the early case, he wouldn't take the view that you have died. He would just say, well, psychological continuity is what you are and you've survived. Later on, he would say, no, you've died, but what matters has survived. So, I mean, one metaphor for thinking about it is the philosopher Jeff McMahon gave me this metaphor. You imagine that you're a horn inside a car, and the horn is not the same as the car, but the horn is dependent on the car. If the car wasn't there, the horn wouldn't be there either. Mm-hmm. And so a person is a bit like that. A person is sort of like the horn inside the body. And if the body wasn't there, obviously the horn wouldn't be there. The horn wouldn't be there. The person wouldn't be there. But they're not identical. That has implications for things like beginning of life and end of life moral decisions, because it might be that the body's still there, the body's still functioning in some way, the heart and the lungs are still functioning, but the brain is gone. So you've gone, but the body is still there. So it might have implications for how we think about taking people off life support systems, for example. It might also have implications for early abortions, for example, because we might think that the early embryo, the body is there, but the person has yet to develop. Mm-hmm. So it might have implications for how we think about embryo research or, as I say, early abortion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, so Parfit has a fairly specific philosophical lineage, but the way you describe it now, he seems almost like an extreme continuation of Descartes, really abiding by a mind-matter split and sort of almost with allegiance to the mind and the body as this thing that, well, that's just a vessel. Don't worry about it too much.
Yeah, no, I don't think he is like Descartes, because Descartes thought that the brain and the body were different substances, as it were. The mind and the body were different substances. Mm-hmm. Parfit has no view about that. You know, in that sense, he's a kind of materialist. We are our bodies and our brains. There's no kind of magical immaterial substance. Mm-hmm. And so he's more in a tradition of Locke and Hume, who think that there's no essence of us, that when we try and reflect on an essence, as Hume would say, all we have is impressions. When we think about I try and think about me and my essence, I don't have that. All I have is impressions of, you know, I can see you now through the video and I can hear various noises. I can have various smells. I don't have any impression of myself, of an essence. Mm. He's more in that tradition, but he takes it further, and his thought experiments are sort of particularly original. And we haven't probably got time to talk about it, but he has various thought experiments about imagining the brain is split in two and who would be the original person if the brain was split in two, because we all have two hemispheres to our brain. But no, he's definitely not Descartes, because he doesn't believe in an immaterial substance.
So I just want to focus on the body, because in the questions, you know, Parfit does have an unusual relationship with his body. I mean, one anecdote is that, I mean, I guess it's not specifically to do with his body, but he wore the same clothes every single day. As soon as, I don't know when he decided to make that decision, but for the sake of practicality, wore the same thing every day for what about the last probably 40 years of his life.
Yeah, I haven't seen any pictures of him where he's not wearing a white shirt and grey trousers. Sometimes he took off his red tie, so there are pictures of him without his red tie. But yeah, he had. When we say the same, philosophers would want to be clear about that. It wasn't exactly the same white shirt or exactly the same grey. There were a set of almost identical white shirts and a set of identical grey trousers, and that was partly because he didn't want to waste time making decisions about what to wear. That was a kind of silly decision that would waste a few seconds of his life, and it was easier just to have the same set of clothing. So he would just take his trousers out of the cupboard, the white shirts off the hanger or out of the drawer, wouldn't have to think about it. You mentioned his unusual attitude to his body. That is true, I think, and that is aligned with his philosophical views. So, as we've discussed, he thought that what mattered to us was psychological continuity. What mattered to us essentially was not our bodies. And that was very much how he thought of his own body. His body was not very important to him. It was, in a way, like a vehicle that he had to keep going. So he would exercise every day, but not because, because he thought that kept his mind alert. He would eat not because he took any pleasure from food, but because the body required food. And he didn't seem to have an awareness of the space that his body took. So there are lots of stories of him sort of sitting very close to people, not in any predatory way. There was nothing kind of sexually perverse or anything like that about it, but sometimes he would sit very close to people, sort of unnaturally close to people, because I think he didn't have this sense of this space around his body that other people had. He was also sort of unusually unaware of sort of dignity about the body. So he would happily sort of, when he was at All Souls, going to go up to the bathroom naked, sort of not really caring whether anybody saw him completely naked or not. So, yeah, that was eccentric. And it was to do with, again, I think the fact that his body was kind of disconnected to his mind in a way that is not typical.
Mm-hmm. Do you think? I mean, there's the book is absolutely filled to the brim with so many of these sort of strange little anecdotes. Do you think, tying this together with, especially with the biography that he had? I mean, happiness isn't everyone's prerogative, but he was content with his life. That he would understand himself to have had a sort of a good life and a successful life.
That's a very good question. But Wittgenstein, I do have a section where I compare them, because in some ways they were similar. I mean, Wittgenstein was a much more important philosopher, I would say, but there were aspects of their character that were quite similar. And Wittgenstein says at the end of his life, I think Wittgenstein was much more tortured than Parfit. Wittgenstein, I think the last line of his life was something like, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life," which you wouldn't have thought, reading biographies about Wittgenstein, that he had a wonderful life, because it was full of agonizing and sort of mental suffering. I think Parfit would say something rather similar. There's a colleague of his from All Souls who said to me that they thought that Derek was depressed, and I don't see any evidence for that. I think that at a subjective level, he felt fulfilled, that he enjoyed doing philosophy, and he was happy doing philosophy, working his butt off. He just worked and worked and worked and worked. But I think he found it satisfying. I think from an objective point of view, when you look at his life, it looks deficient in some ways, because it lacks what many of our lives have. And it didn't have very rich relationships with other people, for example. And he had this hobby, which I talk about in the book. So he was a fanatical photographer and would go to the same cities every year and photograph the same buildings. So he had that as a kind of hobby, but then he gives that up about 18, 19 years before he dies, roughly. And after that, he only has philosophy. And most of us, we have our work, which hopefully is enjoyable work if we're very fortunate, but we also have friends. Some of us have we have families of various degrees, close relatives, more distant relatives. We have social events. We enjoy going to the movies and so on. We have in that way we have rich lives if we're lucky. And obviously he had the resources to have that kind of rich life, but he didn't have that rich life because he was so obsessed by philosophy. So one might say from an objective perspective, he lacked various things that we all have. I think he would have thought that what he was doing was more important. Mm-hmm. And, I have a whole chapter at the end where I ask whether his life was justifiable. And, it's interesting. If you devote everything to a single pursuit, then it's more justifiable if you're successful at that pursuit. So I think in his first book, Reasons and Persons, I think he has this example of somebody who devotes their life to trying to save Venice from being swamped by rising water. And the person dies, and after the person dies, Venice either does get swamped and disappears, or it's saved. In part, let's say, because of the contribution of this person when they were alive. Now, what happens after that person dies, one might say, has some kind of input in how we regard that person's life. So if you devote your whole life to saving Venice, and if after your life it turns out you're successful, one might say, well, that was a successful life. If you devote your entire life to trying to save Venice from drowning, and after you die, despite all your efforts, Venice disappears, well, you might say you've wasted your life. And so whether or not you've had a successful life depends on things that we might only be able to judge after you die. It might depend on how successful you are at it. So whether you think Derek has had a successful life or not will depend on how you judge his philosophy. Given that he spent his entire life, or the latter stage of his life, dedicated to philosophy, and in fact, almost all his life dedicated to philosophy. His early years were he had a bit more variety. If you judge him as a very important philosopher, and I do think he was a very important philosopher, then you'll say, well, it's justified. You had a very narrow life, but it was worthwhile because you made important philosophical contributions. If you think Derek's life was, that his philosophical ideas were not significant, and that he didn't do anything important, you think, oh, Derek, you wasted your entire life. You could have spent more time with your wife and going to your friends' weddings and all that kind of thing. So I think a judgment on Derek's life will depend on your judgment on his philosophy.
Well, okay. I mean, that opens up an interesting line of questions. So I have two questions from there, and the Venice example is actually fairly good. So one question would be, just heading into the future, and I guess on this question of success and whether or not he's been successful, is what would you consider it to be Parfitian? And then from that, I mean, this is why the Venice example is great. This notion of flooding is, what would you say the Parfitian approach to the ongoing and oncoming climate crisis is, with what will be billions of future people?
Right. So, what is it to be Parfitian? People do call themselves Parfitian. I guess you could call yourself Parfitian in various micro ways. So you could call yourself Parfitian if you take his view on personal identity. You could call yourself a Parfitian if you're involved in sort of debates about future people, for example, and you take roughly his approach to future people. So there might be a sort of micro way in which you could call yourself a Parfitian. On a grander scale, he has a very particular approach to moral philosophy. So he uses very sort of clear but dense argumentation. He uses lots of very imaginative thought experiments. So some philosophers don't like, especially sort of the more surreal thought experiments, because they think they're kind of useless. I think a Parfitian would definitely embrace thought experiments and imagine these kind of scenarios that wouldn't necessarily occur in real life, but you imagine them because you test a principle or you test a theory. So you say, well, how would the theory operate in this imaginary world that we conjure up? So I think a Parfitian would definitely use kind of thought experiments in this way. How would he think about future people and climate change? Well, to answer that, I would have to explain his idea on the non-identity problem. So do we have time to? Shall I go into that?
Yeah. I think we'll
okay. Well, the non-identity problem. He spots a very interesting problem in moral philosophy, which is that if we take certain actions, we will affect who is born. So if we take drastic action on climate change, let's say we ban vehicles of various kinds, or insist everybody only uses a bicycle, that will affect who is born. So that in a few generations' time, if we insist that we can only use skateboards and bicycles or non-diesel, non-petrol vehicles, that might affect who is born. Because if you imagine, would you have been born if the car hadn't been invented or the plane hadn't been invented? You would not. Life would be completely different. It's saying, would you have been born if World War II hadn't been invented? No, World War II affected everything. And we are the product of a particular egg and a particular sperm coming together at a particular moment. Now, in a few generations' time, if we don't take drastic action on climate change, then there will be a whole set of people who are born who have very miserable lives because we won't have taken the action that we need to take, and there will be all sorts of consequences. We're seeing the consequences play out in real time as we speak. There's going to be more and more droughts and typhoons and so on. If we do take action, then there'll be a whole different set of people who will be born, who will have lives which are much better than the people who would have been born had we not taken that action. But, and this is what Parfit spots, there will be no single person who is worse off. So imagine we don't take any action. Several generations down the line, there will be a whole set of people who have very miserable lives because of the droughts and so on. But had we not taken action, it's a very complicated point, so it's difficult to follow, but had we not taken action, they wouldn't have existed. A whole different set of people would have existed. So those people who have lives which are, let's assume they're miserable, they're better than nothing, but they're not great lives. In a way, they have no cause for complaint. Because had we taken action, they wouldn't exist. There would be a whole different set of people who would exist. So what's Parfit's view on that? Parfit's view is we still must take action, but we have to think about these problems about future people in a completely different way. The way we think about why we must take action is not because we're making lives for people better several generations down the line. It's because it is better to have a population who have flourishing lives, let's call them population A, than a completely different set of people, let's call them population B, who have much less good lives. It's not because we're helping any one particular life. It's because we take a kind of impartial, consequentialist view, and we think it's better to have one set of people who have flourishing lives than another set of people who have much less flourishing lives. Not because any particular person is made better off by us taking action on climate change.
That is a strong stance. I mean, and
it takes a bit of getting your head around it. I explain it in slightly more length, and I hope with clarity in the book. But it's called the non-identity problem. It's a very interesting puzzle. It affects a lot of moral puzzles that we need to think about, and it's a puzzle that I say in the book that not many philosophers come up with new problems or new puzzles. Philosophy's been around for a long time. We've mostly got we understand what the main problems are. We understand that there's the problem of free will, there's the problem of consciousness, and so on. And it takes an unusual mind to come up with an original puzzle. and the non-identity problem is an original puzzle. So Parfit has to be credited with that. He comes up with something completely new that once you mention it, seems completely obvious. It seems completely obvious that certain actions that we take will affect the kind of people that will be born. That if I decide not to have a child now, but to have a child in 6 months' time, obviously that will be a different kind of child. A different child, not a kind of child. It will be a different child. So if I delay having a child, then it will affect the type. It will affect the people who are being born, and so we have to think about various problems about future people in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm. So I guess a couple of questions just here at the end, just to keep it within time. One would be, where should one begin with Parfit's work? And I think people might be a little bit surprised to hear there's not necessarily a lack, but there is only a small amount of actual defined texts, which there is a lot of biographical stuff behind Parfit's sort of probably annoyance to publishers over the years. And as the book, as we mentioned, he's so eccentric and there's all these anecdotes. I mean, so that first question about where should one begin with this work, but also what is your favorite anecdote of Parfit's that you put in the book as well?
So he only wrote 2 books in his life, and that sort of underplays how much work there was, because the first one, Reasons and Persons, is nearly 500 pages, and the second book comes out in 3 volumes, 2 volumes in 2011 and 1 volume just published posthumously in 2017, and that comes out, I think, at 1900 pages. So they're enormous. I would start with Reasons and Persons if I was beginning one of the 2 books. It's a book that you have to read slowly. So, if you read 5 pages of Reasons and Persons a day, that would take you a very long time to finish it. But it's very dense, and but it's very clear. So if you read it slowly, you can understand everything, and it's very compelling and fascinating. Just really very, very interesting. So I would definitely start off the 2 books. I would start with Reasons and Persons. The biography has it's mainly biography, but 25% probably of the book, or 30% is philosophy. So it has a summary of the main arguments. What was the most interesting or my favorite anecdote? Well, I mean, there were so many. There's one that's sort of appeared on the internet and a lot, and people kind of tweet it a lot, and it is quite an interesting story. It's about a sort of a bit of video, which I think is fake video, but Parfit didn't realize it was fake video, of Hitler seen doing a little jig celebrating when Germany, I think, invades Czechoslovakia, I think it is. The full story's in the book, and Hitler is shown to be sort of happy at the success of the military operation. And a friend of mine was with Derek at that stage, and Derek says something really bizarre. He says, "Well, at least something good came out of it. At least somebody was happy, in other words." And what he means is that if you have a world, however that world is, it is better if there is one person in the world who is happier than that person otherwise would have been. That more happiness is better than less happiness. So even the happiness of somebody who we might think is totally undeserving of any happiness, it is better that that person is happy than that person is not happy. He had this view about punishment, which is that punishment could be justified. So it's worth having prisons and systems of deterrence, because that prevents people, for example, from behaving badly. Mm. But there's no reason to punish somebody just because they've done something bad. There may be a reason to punish somebody to make the world go better, or to stop that person from committing future crimes, so to lock somebody dangerous away. But the idea that the world is a better place because somebody is suffering is something he found abhorrent. Mm. So just as it is a better world with less suffering, so it is a better world with more happiness. So that's how that weird anecdote. So nobody else would have that reaction. You know, if anybody else saw that, the idea of Hitler being happy, nobody would think, oh, you know, at least one person was happy. Now, that's such a weird reaction to that little video, but it makes sense within the context of his philosophy.
And also, I guess it shows the extremes of his philosophy as well.
Yeah, it does, and it shows in a way how counterintuitive his philosophy is, because that's not a reaction. Most of us have very retributist instincts. So we think if somebody really terrible has done something really terrible, we take some kind of satisfaction out of the idea that they will be punished, that they get their just deserts. Desert was something he couldn't make any sense of. He didn't believe in desert. Whereas most people have this idea that if somebody does something bad, they deserve to be punished. It's not just that we punish them to deter others, or it's not just that we punish them to prevent them doing something bad in the future. It's the idea they deserve to be punished. That was something Parfit couldn't make any head or tail of, and he had no instincts that would sort of back up the idea that people deserve to be punished. He didn't feel that at all. He didn't think people deserved to be punished.
Mm-hmm. There's a testament to his character. I mean, some might say there was sort of a naivety, but which at some points it feels like that, but at other points he's almost sort of a very pure and almost innocent individual.
It's definitely unusual. Definitely unusual.
Well, that seems to be a good place to finish up. I'm sure the book Parfit, A Philosopher and His Mission to Save Morality, can be found in all good bookstores, I imagine, and also at the Princeton website, and I'll put links in the description below. I mean, have you now got any plans to write another biography, or what are you working on now?
Not another biography, but I'm working on another famous thought experiment. So I wrote a book about 12 years ago, I think, at least a decade ago now, on a famous thought experiment involving a runaway trolley that could kill 5 people, then you could turn it and it would just kill 1. And that's one scenario. In another scenario, the runaway train or the runaway trolley is going to kill 5 people, and the only way to save the 5 people is to push somebody over a footbridge who will stop the train, but they will die. And we have different intuitions about those two thought experiments, and I wrote a whole book on that thought experiment called Would You Kill the Fat Man? And I'm going to write another book about another very famous thought experiment in moral philosophy about a person who's drowning in a shallow pond, a child who's drowning in a shallow pond, and you walk past the child in the shallow pond, and you hear the child crying, and you look around, there's no parent and there's no guardian, and you're about to save the child from drowning. The pond is so shallow, there's no threat to you, and then you realize you're wearing your most expensive shoes. And if you go in and save the child from the shallow pond, you will ruin your extremely expensive shoes, and you wonder whether you should save the child or save your expensive shoes. Well, in that thought experiment, everybody says that, of course, you should save the child and not save your expensive shoes. And the person who comes up with this thought experiment, who's still alive, Peter Singer, a very influential moral philosopher who's in my Parfit book as well, he says that in essence, we are walking past a shallow pond every day of our lives. So every day we could effectively save a child at minimal cost to ourselves by giving money to effective charities, and by failing to do that, we're no better than the person who worries about their shoes rather than saving the child. So it's very controversial, and the book will look at this thought experiment and the influence it's had.
Sounds interesting. It's a good thing I don't have any expensive shoes. Well, David Edmonds, it's been a delight. Thank you very much. And as I said, I will put the links in the description below for the book for those who are interested. But thank you very much.
Thanks, James. I enjoyed it. Thank you.